sudden an anthropologist has appeared. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jack Friedman, who's a cultural anthropologist. Got his PhD from Duke University, and he was not here at the University of Oklahoma when the Climate Science Center was initiated. I wish he had been. He would have been one of our co-PIs and working on the proposal, because he just has an extraordinary ability to work across and between disciplines. And part of that might be he's married to an ecologist, and so he's used to talking to people who think about things in orderly manners, and so he has to help to provide that positive, disruptive influence on us to think about things in different ways. So Jack works for the Center for Applied Social Research here at the University of Oklahoma, and he's also one of the lead researchers in our Oklahoma EPSCoR program. Jack.
So I'm terrible about keeping my own time, so I'm going to occasionally break the wall and look down at my phone and look up at people and everything else. So I was asked to talk about human impacts, which felt pretty big, and fortunately Derek was kind enough to say, run with it how you'd like, and that's exactly what I decided I'm going to do. So this is, I think, it's sort of the polar opposite, but at the same time very much a complement to what Joe did earlier. Joe presented some very clear data. You're not going to see as much clear data in this. I'm going to tell you stories about human impacts and about sort of how people think through things. The first thing, my biggest concern though was to think through how many social scientists I was going to have in the room. How many social scientists are there? Okay, so a few. I'm glad. I apologize if things are a little bit, if things are a little bit simplified for you, but I think at the same time that there are, the way that I approached this was to think through that sort of collaborative frame. What is it that how would you summarize your social sciences and bring them to other fields when you start to collaborate with them? So who am I? I'm a cultural anthropologist. As Renee said, I'm running the ethnographic portion of the Oklahoma EPSCoR project. And given the scale of EPSCoR, these are more resources than most anthropologists will ever see in their life. So I'm feeling very pleased about it, as well as very intimidated by it. Anthropologists tend not to be that strong stream for lots of funding. But in addition to this work in sort of ecological anthropology, I didn't start my life there. And one of the other things Derek told me to do was make sure to tell your history. So I'm actually going to start with a story from my original field work. But my original field work was mostly along the lines of political, psychological, I can put political up there, so political, psychological, and economic anthropology. And then I had a second life in which I did a lot of work, and I still do a lot of work in on psychiatry and mental health. I'm going to skip that slide. So my original research for my PhD was in Romania, and it had very little to do with anything environmental or ecological when I started doing work there. And early on, or actually it was when I came back from a second very long period of time there, somebody asked me for a story, and I sort of was thinking about how do I encapsulate the changes that I saw in this region where I did research. And the region is down, oh no, no laser, is down here. Ah, there we go, thank you. And this region is in the Transylvanian Alps and the Carpathian Mountains. That means that it's in Transylvania. And the main sort of capital city is called Petroșani. I spent most of my time living in a small town outside of there called LUPENI. And this is a coal mining region. So the story that I'm going to tell you is basically starting my fieldwork, my PhD fieldwork, so back when I was a graduate student, at the very moment when they started closing coal mines, which was a little unexpected to everybody. So I think I'll just go from there. And I'm going to actually read this to you. It's straight out of my field notes. It takes about 5 minutes, so I promise I won't read to you for the next 30 minutes or something. When I first arrived in the Jiu Valley, I traveled in the dead of night, leaving Bucharest at 11 p.m. and arriving at the guest rooms of the University of Petroșani at 5 a.m., where I would stay for 2 months until I settled on which city in the region I would move to in order to do research. I knew that the train during the last leg of the journey would travel through a stretch of the Carpathian Mountains that ran parallel to a long valley that cut north-south through the southern Carpathians. But it was not until several days after my arrival that I went on a walking tour of sorts through Petroșani with a history professor at the university. And I finally saw the river. The Jiu River was not especially impressive. It was, at this point in its progress, a few dozen meters across and a few meters deep, punctuated with large boulders that turned the water turbulent. The water was a rich, murky brown, entirely opaque. This, my professor friend told me, was because of the coal mining process. The miners sprayed water on the walls of the mines to minimize the dangers from coal dust in the deep shafts, a dual danger since the coal dust was highly combustible, as well as being the source of black lung disease. The water was then pumped out of the mines and into the river to keep the mines from flooding. In addition, the processing of the coal, which, when it came out of the mines, involved the use of water. As the raw coal came to the surface, it was transported to large preparation complexes, where, using gravity, it vibrated through a series of water baths so that the heaviest coal, which was the lowest quality coal, could be sorted from the lightest coal, which is the highest quality coal. I learned an awful lot about coal. This water also was dumped back into the Jiu River. The professor who I was with waxed ironic over this. The brown water meant pollution for some, he said, but it also meant that the mines were still functioning. You could tell when the mines were closed for a holiday, in fact, because the water would begin to clear. When I returned to the Jiu Valley several years after my original fieldwork in the region, to begin a new research project on mental illness in Romania's declining regions, things appeared to have suffered from the intervening years. This did not surprise me, since it had been almost a decade since the state had started to close the coal mines in the region, in essence destroying the sole source of employment for the majority of the population. As in the late 1990s, people began to were continuing to talk about this idea of moving away from reliance on coal mining and moving toward taking advantage of the beauty of their mountains. The idea of moving toward ecotourism. They dreamt of drawing on the natural beauty of the mountains and its proximity to the Repeza National Park, a natural preserve that still had some of the few native populations of wild wolves and brown bears in Europe. All of this in order to draw on sort of a fantasized wealth of the Westerner. Bring them in, they'd pay lots of money for ecotourism, and it would keep the communities afloat. However, nobody really seemed to believe that this would happen. This was, in the minds of most people, still a region that was born from the mines and the coal, and the coal was its raison d'etre. The statues that commemorated the work of the miners and the sacrifices made by the miners in labor struggles that swept the region in the 1920s and 1930s still stood, staining their marble bases with oxidized runoff from the muscular features of miners wearing raincoats and helmets and headlamps carrying pickaxes and kerosene lamps and pneumatic jacks. So when I was asked what had changed, in my eyes, what had changed most was the river. It was clean now. It ran clear and cold and strong. The banks of the river were still covered with garbage thrown in or washed down in the rush of the water from the snow-covered peaks of the surrounding mountains. Specks of blue plastic bags and candy wrappers, plastic soft drink bottles, and the carcasses of dead animals. But the river was clear. Looking closer, though, the river also appeared to be dead. There were no fish. The only life that seemed to flourish was a green algae that covered submerged rocks. So, the mines had closed, the river ran clear, but life was gone. Anybody who's worked in Eastern Europe shouldn't be surprised by a grim story for many people. Oh. And then you're going to know a lot more when I say that I lived for 3 years in Valladolid. Yeah, I think you'll probably get some confirmation about just how bad it is from a native here. So again, I didn't start my life doing things with ecology. But when somebody asked me a question ultimately about what had changed in this region, it was funny because that was the indicator for me. It was something that surprised me actually when I wrote this years and years and years ago. So ultimately though, how does all of this get me to the South Central climate region? Well, there are transitions and there are continuities. The primary continuity is that all of my work has been really focused on the question of collapse. How people respond to stress, how people respond to collapsing situations, whether it's economic, cultural, public, private, social, families collapsing, things like this. So this includes then the second major project that I worked on, which was on mental illness and mental health care, which often one of the sometimes causes, always consequences of mental illness was a lot of collapse and stress and catastrophe around families, around communities, things like this. All of this gave me a skill set, in essence, to start to think about what are these human impacts on different regions in Oklahoma, in my case, in terms of what happens with climate change. So I started asking a series of questions. How are systems, communities, and individuals impacted by climate change and ecological crisis? Well, that's a big umbrella question. But what I found out very quickly was I was very unsatisfied with the idea of doing this by myself. Again, as Renee said, I'm a collaborator at heart. I love collaborating with real scientists. So you guys over here where I saw the social scientists, you can boo and hiss at me, I don't care. But I love collaborating with natural scientists and physical scientists. But I also then very quickly began to realize that the way that natural and physical scientists often thought about using a social scientist tended to be a bit problematic. There were a lot of assumptions about what people are like and why they do what they do. And it's funny because a lot of what I'm about to say sounds an awful lot like what Kelvin said earlier. So maybe this has been a theme over the last 5 days. But what I found very quickly was that when most environmental scientists ask questions about society, they are usually driven by just a few questions. So some ask, how do we make them stop doing stupid things? Those who are a bit more thoughtful might ask, how do we make them understand that what they're doing is stupid? But it's the rare environmental scientist who even thinks to ask, why do they do stupid things? It's the most fundamental question. It's the question that makes the social scientist a scientist too. And so in beginning to collaborate with a lot of environmental scientists, I very quickly realized you've got to sort of lay out what is it that social science does? What is it what are the questions that you ask, and what is it that we bring to this in terms of our understanding about society? I always like to go back to what, if anybody's taken an intro to anthropology class, it seems completely mundane, but it's incredibly useful and valuable in conversations that I have with many ecological scientists and environmental scientists, but also actually with many other social scientists. So this distinction comes from Roy Rappaport's fairly famous book called Pigs for the Ancestors. Many people well outside of anthropology seem to reference it. It's a book from the early 60s on it's an early fundamental foundational book on ecological anthropology, looking at a small community of 200 people in Papua New Guinea. Classic anthropology place. But he makes a distinction in terms of how one can approach the question of what is ecology. And he says that you can start by thinking about this as what he terms cognized models. The model of the environment as conceived by the people who actually live in that environment. How is it that they think about it? This is in anthropology terms, this is the native's point of view. But he also suggests then that there's this other perspective, which is what he terms operational models. The model of the environment that's constructed by, in this case, social scientists, but it could be an environmental scientist. Through observation and measurements of empirical entities, events, and material relationships. In other words, it's stepping back. It's saying, well, I understand you believe that, but I've counted the number of calories that you've eaten. I've looked at the entire makeup of your entire community here. You know, all of the plants that are in the area, things like this. So you might believe that it has something to do with spirits. Why you do things, when you do them, why, you know, in the various ways that you do them. But in fact, I have a very different explanation for you. And this is a classic distinction in anthropology between what's called an emic and an etic perspective. The emic being the insider's view, and the etic being the outsider's view. What I quickly found is that many of the environmental scientists that I was working with only could think about the etic. And if there was anything emic, it was always kind of, this is the exotic thing we'll throw in. It's the thing that maybe we want to lead with in our presentation. We're going to say that, oh, in such and such a region, Native Americans for thousands of years have believed in such, and then you move on. You never really come back to that. Without recognizing that actually these, I'll go back to what my task was, human impacts are all about that basic experiential component. So I said I would tell two stories. So one was an esoteric and quote-unquote exotic story from Eastern Europe. I will now give you a story from a little closer to home. And specifically, I'm going to focus, and for some of you have heard at least bits of this before, and talk about Sardis Lake, which is down here in southeast Oklahoma. So Sardis Lake is a hot spot of controversy right now in the state. People are fighting over the water. This is probably not too surprising if you know this part of the world. Obviously, the first thing you need to understand, though, about Sardis Lake is that it's... Can anybody tell what that is back there? So yeah, that's a dam. So it's not a natural lake. Nothing in Oklahoma. I don't think we have anything. I don't think so. I think that was and they're actually calling them lakes by some definition.
I don't know that they're named.
Okay. I think that is as much a problem as anything else. You know, it's where is the definition for it? But central to sort of understanding what's going on with Sardis Lake then is to ask the basic question about ownership, where it came from. And this is long before we start to get to that insider's viewpoint, that native's viewpoint. The perhaps uncontroversial facts about the case are that it was built by the Corps of Engineers, originally funded by the federal government, state government, all of which was on bonds, and ultimately, Oklahoma City paid off the debt. So there's the economics of this. There are also rules in there about what it can be used for, and these are written into the original arrangement with the Corps of Engineers. It can be used for municipal water use, used for flood control, it can be used for recreation. It cannot be used for irrigation. Why does this matter? So Sardis is, by its very nature, a very human-constructed lake. Things don't look particularly natural there. And many of the people, I think, sort of associated, who are not actually using the lake, frequently think about it as a resource. The folks who are there actually think about it in an entirely different way, even though it is very man-made. And they're really worried that they're going to lose the lake, that Oklahoma City is going to sweep in and steal all the water. So the question is, how bad could it be? So Oklahoma City is going to take some water from a decent-sized lake. There's another lake. So this is in the North Canadian watershed. And this is called Canton Lake. And if you remember from the last photograph, I think it's a nice comparison. There's little bobbers here. And you can see them now lying on the sand here. So Canton Lake is almost entirely reliant, sorry, the town of Canton is almost entirely reliant on the lake for its economy. In 2013, at sort of the tail end of what was really, really, really a bad drought, it's still not over, but somebody, I think, called it at some point. Oklahoma City needed to replenish its reservoirs and decided to release 30,000 acre-feet of water. I did this, I got these numbers on what that means in terms of gallons, and it's close to 10 billion gallons. It's kind of running out of digits on my little calculator on my computer. So the water dropped by 13 feet, and I checked this morning. So as of 3 a.m. this morning, it's still 13 feet down, so this is a year and a half later. And for all intents and purposes, this effectively destroyed the economic base of this community. The community relies almost entirely on tourism, almost entirely on this lake. And between January 13th and January 14th, a third of the town's businesses closed. So when people wonder about why Sardis Lake and the people around it are worried, they immediately say, well, look at Canton Lake. So this is, and I just took these photos. I'm not a great photographer. I wish I had been in a helicopter. What you have here is about 150 meters of sand that used to be water. This is the beach right here, back here. These are all the dead trees now. So this is, it's fairly catastrophic, and it hasn't bounced back at all. So if we go back to Sardis Lake, you hear different perspectives on this, and this is where you start to get the various sides of how to understand human impacts. and the different perspectives that different social scientists will bring to this. So this is the other, it's probably pedantic. I'm probably being pedantic when I say this, but for those of you who are environmental scientists, ecological scientists, you're a hydrologist or a meteorologist, and you want to work with a social scientist, we're not all the same. You can't put us all together. We all start from very different perspectives. And you see this fairly quickly once you start to lay out a scenario. So I'll talk about this in a second. But here's the scenario that we have. OKC, Oklahoma City's perspective on SARDIS is, we paid for it, we get it. Also, you hear a more sort of functionalist argument rather than just a purely capitalist argument. We have the biggest population in the state to support, we drive the state's economy, we've got the greatest need, and the water will help the most people here. From the communities around Sardis Lake, our lives and lives, so these are quotes from people who I was talking to there. Our lives and livelihoods are connected to the lake. Our lives and livelihoods are more important than your golf courses. We've already had to adapt to the loss of one livelihood in the area with the flooding of the region. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now we're being told that the cost we paid was for nothing. These are two perspectives. I suppose we'll throw in the academics' perspective also, maybe not just academics, but environmental science. Ecosystems in the Kiamichi will be decimated by the loss of the water in Sardis Lake. Scientists are people too, so I suppose we should study them also. So, if we take another view of Sardis, before we had that view from the lake looking out at the dam, this is a different view of Sardis, and I'll point something out to you. There's this little lake, or sorry, this little island right here. Can you make that light white line out? I don't know how easily you can see that. So, what that white line is this. Now, it's not easy, and for those of you who've already heard me give this story, don't give this away. For those of you who haven't heard, can anybody make sense of what you see in this picture and the last picture also? What do we have in this picture? Cemetery, and what was that? What was? And a land bridge. That's pretty much what we have here. A cemetery and a land bridge going out to that tiny island. Anybody imagine what that is? So, like I said, everybody talks about the fact that they already suffered once, and they've adapted to it. The reason it's called Sardis Lake is because there was a town called Sardis. The town is now under the lake. However, when the Corps of Engineers built this, they decided to build up one area, this little island, and it sits right above the town's cemetery. And what you have here is not just a bunch of land sitting above a cemetery that's submerged, but it's actually a living cemetery. So that all the people who used to live in Sardis, who were displaced to now live in all the communities around Sardis, still bury their families out there. These are all new tombstones and markers and things like this. I was going out there looking around thinking, oh, these are going to be all old things that were pulled up, because I'd kind of heard this story, but I didn't know any details on it. I thought they were like headstones that had been moved. But no, they're all new. They're all things with, date 2006, things like this. And what you don't see if you're looking that way behind you is actually a structure for doing funerals, things like this. So the question is, how do we think about human impacts when we think about this lake vanishing around Sardis, the lake that vanished around Canton? Well, there are different ways to think about how we can fix this or how we can approach the sort of the social side to all of this. And this is where I was warning you in advance that not all social scientists are alike. I like to think about these as the naive approaches, and you'll see why. They won't sound naive when I first start saying them, but I'm going to argue that they are the naive approaches. One approach is to say that, well, all the actors around there need to act in a rational manner. The water wasn't theirs to start with. We're part of a system. Move on with your lives. You change the cost structure in order to incentivize people in various ways to do new things. The same thing, of course, can be said about Oklahoma City. Yeah, well, you don't need all this water. You don't need to be using this resource that is under a great deal of duress to water your golf courses during a time of drought. Therefore, we need to incentivize behavior away from this. So assuming that people are very rational. But another way of thinking about people is to assume that they're grounded basically in their communities, and that what would change them is to think about things in terms of the community. So to change things, you would use social organizations and institutions to change the way people look at environmental issues. You can think about this in various ways, but you're going to, among other things, you can think about it as public education. But also that idea that we heard earlier today, that one good leader in a community can change a whole lot in that community, much faster than a bunch of scientists going in and lecturing people. This is what you should do. We can also assume, though, that behavior is primarily shaped by relationships of power and conflict. And in this case, what you would need is a system that puts limitations on those with power and resources in order to ensure that costs are borne equally. So the real questions for folks and to understand human impacts is to understand this whole cluster of ways of approaching things. Any one of those clusters usually is covered by certain disciplines in the social sciences. The rational side, which disciplines? The dark discipline. I'm sorry? It could be. Actually, psychology is a curiosity because it's got so many different pieces. But it could, some folks in psychology, certainly. But I think the most obvious thing is economics. But it has a very strong, it has a lot of hold also in political sciences and a lot of hold also in sociology. You find far less of that in anthropology, where it's all about the community. Very touchy-feely discipline. What about the question of power? To a certain extent, I think that crosses over all of them, but it depends. As much as anything, it's a different kind of a stance, because to a certain extent, it's being driven by Marxist ideas, Marxist philosophies about, which can show up in any sort of social science discipline. But the question then to ask is, who are these rational actors? What would be the rational solution? Is there one rational solution? And are all parties operating on the same shared set of rational principles? Municipal planners in OKC, the local kayak rental store in Clayton, which is just outside, just on the edge of the lake, or the scientists studying aquatic fauna in the Kiamichi River. What's the community? So It's a popular thing to say, well, we're going to study communities. What is this community? Community Oklahoma? The community, say, the metro area, the OKC metro area versus the Kiamichi watershed. I can break this down a lot more. I mean, in the Kiamichi watershed, everybody around Sardis hates everybody in Hugo. That's an exaggeration. Hugo is a town down the southern end of the Kiamichi. The main reason is because Hugo doesn't really use the lake very much. They might use it a little bit, but they don't rely on it. And Hugo was involved with a huge attempt to sell the water from the lake to Texas. Oh no. So it's not even that kind of regional understanding of community. It gets down in the weeds really quickly. And where's the power? And what I always like to say is, does any of the rest of this matter? Does any of the rest of this matter? Until you understand who has the power and who can wield the power most effectively. So I'm going to end here. I have no idea where I am with time. I'm going to end here. This is from my last trip down there. I was just driving. I was telling somebody else this. I think last time I showed this slide, a couple months ago, I was just driving through the area and driving along and see this. There are skid marks on the road. I had to stop and take a picture of this. This is just up. This isn't, you know, this is the way a lot of people feel in the rest of the state, and this starts to give you a feel. It's very impressionistic, I know. I'm not giving you numbers on stress, numbers on various other indicators that one can use. We'll do that as social scientists. I could bore you with those things. I think it's more interesting to give you a feel for how people respond to these kinds of crises. I have a feeling you've been hearing an awful lot of more technical talks of the last few days. Maybe not, but I did see I was sort of the last speaker on the list. I said, well, let's do something with a lot of stories rather than boring you with a lot of statistics. So I'll stop there, and I guess I can take questions for however long I've got.